Welcome to the 10th and final day of the computer building extravaganza. Today we're going to go through the process of actually building a retro PC. As you can see, I've gathered all of the parts that we're going to need. So let's spend a bit of time reviewing what we've got here, and then we'll get on with getting this stuff into the case, installing an operating system, and loading up some games. The BIOS are M5 SIB. I chose it due to the small form factor. It fits perfectly into the case, which does not have a lot of extra room. The board uses the SIS 5598 chipset, which has decent shared 2MB integrated graphics. It's comparable to the Intel 430TX and can support CPUs anywhere from a Pentium 60 through an AMD K62 333. It also supports Cyrix and RDT Win chips. The board has a header for frontside USB, which is nice if you want to upgrade it to something like Windows 98, and also uses an integrated ESS 1869 sound chip. It has 512 kilobytes of level 2 cache and can support a maximum of 384 megabytes of memory. It has 2 ISA and 3 PCI slots, USB, 1 serial and 1 parallel port, as well as connections for video, joystick, line in, mic in, and speaker out. Trying to plan for future upgrades and thinking about how many pitfalls I ran into back on both my 75 and 120 MHz Pentiums, I decided to go with a 200 MMX. It should be able to run anything from the mid to late 90s. Just a heatsink fan combo should do the trick. One of the nice things about the old chips is that they didn't run hot enough to require thermal paste, which makes swapping them out for other ones much faster. 32 megabytes of PC100 SRAM. The 3DFX Voodoo 3 2000 PCI. Although there aren't a ton of DOS games optimized for Glide, the ones that are will look beautiful. And again, thinking of a possible upgrade, this will definitely come in handy with Windows 98. Since one of the things we're doing in the channel is to modernize classic systems, we're going to go with a 16GB SATA SSD. We're also going to use this nifty Kingwin SATA hot swappable drive bay that will allow us to remove the drive if we need to for the purposes of copying files to it or swapping it out with a different one that perhaps has a different operating system on it. On the back of the drive bay are SATA connectors. So the other thing we're going to need is a StarTech IDE to SATA converter. What this does is this allows us to plug into a SATA device on this side, and on the other side we have a standard 40-pin IDE connector that would go to a motherboard. So the way this whole contraption is going to look like in the back is the StarTech device is going to plug in to this device like that. Okay, that's plugged in, that's ready to go. Now we get our 40-pin IDE cable that we normally connect to a spinning drive. That's going to get plugged into the back of the device like that. This side obviously goes to the motherboard, and this makes the motherboard think it's connected to an actual spinning hard drive. Then all we need is to grab some power. Let's plug in our power to this back to this device here, and we don't lose it because it's got a pigtail right here. So that's the back of it. That's how it's going to look when it's all hooked up. Now on the front of it, we have a slot here for the actual drive itself. So we're going to plug the drive in just like that. There we go. Drive's in. Now we have a power light, a power button here. Turn it on. Obviously it should be on when we boot the system where it's not going to see the drive, but turn it on before we boot the system. Gives us power, lets us know that it has power, and then every time the hard drive is accessed, this light will flash, similar to our hard drive access light and the rest for retro computers. And that's it. We've got a hot swappable hard drive on a motherboard from the 90s. Again, in an attempt to go somewhat modern, we're going to use a SATA DVD-ROM, and then using the same adapter we used for the hard drive, we'll plug this into the back of the DVD-ROM. So, back here, again, same device, works in multiple locations. We'll plug this in the back here, and again, connect our 40-pin cable, our power, and we've just upgraded our optical drive from a CD-ROM to a DVD-ROM. Just a 600 watt semi-modular, so I only have to connect what's needed. Again, considering the size of the case, it just seems to make more sense, and 600 watts is way more power than this system will ever need. So for those of you who had never built systems before, what I like to do when I go to build a system, before I put the motherboard into the case, is put as many things onto the motherboard as I possibly can, which means install the CPU, the CPU cooler, the memory, is make sure all the jumpers are set correctly for the CPU. So in this case, the voltage and the multiplier and so on are all set correctly on the board. So on this board, for instance, I've already got the jumpers, which are right here, set correctly for the voltage and a Pentium 200 MMX processor. That's all set up correctly. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the CPU. Now, if you've never installed the CPU before, the way these usually work, especially on these old socket 7s, is all the CPUs, especially like if you look at this one here, it's got a cutoff corner right, there. So all the other corners are actual corners where the pins come straight to the corner, but at this cutoff one, the pins kind of form half a triangle right there. So the way this is going to work is in the actual socket, what you're going to do is you're going to lift up the arm, which basically opens the socket. You look for the part on the board where the socket is actually chopped out, one of the corners is chopped off. So let's go ahead and zoom in that part of the socket right there. Put this in focus real quick. And if you look right here on the board, you got the same chopped off corner. All the other corners are identical except this chopped off one. So you're going to take your CPU and you're going to line up that chopped off corner with the one in the socket. You're going to line it up until the pins align and it actually falls into place. Now that it's down, you just lower the arm to lock the pins into place. And that's it. Socket's installed. Now we're going to take our cooler, this guy right here, and the way this is going to work is on either side of the motherboard you'll see these plastic tabs. There's one here and there's one here. The way the cooler works is you're going to look for a place where you can basically attach these two tabs at. So usually the best way for this to work is to set the cooler on top of the CPU. Right? Take one side and put it in so it's actually in place. Now we'll turn it around so you can see better. On this side, you're just going to push this down, clip it underneath this side until it's nice and tight. Okay, that's it. Now you're just going to plug in your power for your fan into the motherboard there. Now we're going to go ahead and install the memory into slot 1. The memory, you basically line up these keyholes here. There's one here and one there. And on the memory socket, again, you see there's a tab here and a tab here for those two keyholes. So you just line this up with those tabs, push down until the arms lock into place. So you'll hear them and you'll see them lock up. See how both of these guys both pop into place. You know, the memory is inserted as best it can be. It's locked into place. Now it's good. So that's as many things as we do with the board. Now that the board is no longer without the things it needs. We got the processor installed, the cooling fan, and the memory. We know for the fact that our jumpers are set correctly for the voltage and the multiplier for the CPU, and we're all set to have a Pentium 200 running in this board. That's as many things as we can do with the board. So let's go ahead and take a look at the case. We'll open up the side of it and I will show you how the board is installed in the case. So this is the case we'll be using. As you can tell, this is a mini ATX case, and what we're going to do here is we're going to turn it sideways and then take a look and see what we're dealing with on the inside of this. So, okay, put this over here. Right, so we got 2 5¼ bays, and it looks like 3 2.5-inch bays, one of which is hidden. I'm sorry, 3.5-inch bays, one of which is hidden. Place for a power supply. It comes with a couple of fans. We have connectors for the front side. Looks like just your standard hard drive reset power switch, power lights, front side audio, and front side USB, which, as I said, with that motherboard would come in handy. That way you can use these guys here for your front side USB. So, not too bad. Could be better, could be worse. I've dealt with smaller cases. So let's go ahead and get the motherboard and set it in there and see how it looks, and we'll go from there. So as you can see, there's holes in the back of the case for installation of the motherboard. There's obviously holes over the place, but all the holes that have these nifty little circles around them here are for mounting standoffs for us to put the motherboard on top of, and then put a screw in to secure the motherboard onto this back plate here. Generally speaking, this is also the point in time where you want to install your I/O shield, which will go right here. However, unfortunately, one of the drawbacks to buying used motherboards on eBay is the fact that 9 times out of 10 they rarely ever come with an I/O shield, especially not something from circa 1995-96. Also, it's almost kind of funny. You can't find I/O shields for ATX boards, and you can't find AT cases anywhere, in which case you wouldn't need the I/O shield. So it's kind of, you lose either way. But the way this would normally go now is, after I install the I/O shield, I would go ahead and take the board and line it up with the holes on the back of that and see which ones line up. So, in this case, this is going to be difficult to do. The way this would go is, I'd take a look down and see how many of these holes actually lined up with the holes that are on the board. And then I'd figure out which places I need to install standoffs in order to mount the board correctly. Now, if you look at the board, I've zoomed into a specific section so I can show you. There are holes in it for mounting. All the holes you see that look like this, here, there's one here. On this board, I believe there are 6. 3 in the bottom, 3 in the top. Any one that has this silver ring around it is designed for screwing the board into a standoff, mounting it. They've been specially designed that way so they won't short circuit once you start running electricity through the board, and they're designed specifically for mounting. Now, other holes, like this guy down here, there's usually 1 in each corner. On this board, there's 3 corners. There's 1 and 4. And those are specifically for plastic standoffs you can put in from the bottom of the board that will give the board extra support. So when you're, say, plugging in a video card or a sound card or some kind of expansion card of the board, it doesn't flex that much. Or if it starts to flex, the standoff will go into the hole and prevent it from, say, bending too far down towards the case. The standoffs look similar to this. Okay. Little Christmas tree looking thing. Oops. And the way it works is you take the board and you put these things through this little hole right here at the bottom. Okay. And this one doesn't want to go in, but the way it would normally work is once it's down, there we go, like that, it prevents the board from, say, flexing right there. So let's say I wanted to put another one near the top, in the top corner of the board to prevent it from flexing there. And then say 1 more in the other corner so I could prevent it from flexing there. So we'll slide the board over, and there's the last one right here. Okay, so we'll pick it up, put this last one in from the bottom. There we go. So now, assuming this is sitting on all the standoffs like it's supposed to, on all 6 standoffs, let's zoom back out. Okay. So now the board is, if it's sitting in all the standoffs, it's going to be something like this. When I push down on, say, the slots, say this one here or this one here, the board won't flex as much because the standoffs in the corners here and here will prevent it from moving around as much as it would be otherwise. And it just makes it a little better for the board. You know, you don't want it flexing too much once it's inside the case. So those little plastic standoffs are nice to have in the board to prevent that kind of thing from happening. On this board, obviously, since it has integrated sound and integrated audio, or I'm sorry, video, if you wanted to just use what was built into the board, you wouldn't have to install any cards, short of maybe like a network card or a modem if you wanted to do network. You could use everything that's built onto the board and be done with it. But on the off chance you wanted to use your own video, your own sound, your own everything, every time you plugged in a card to the board, it would want to flex a little bit. And this just helps prevent that from happening. That's what those holes that don't have silver rings around them are for. So remember, holes with silver rings are for mounting in the case. Holes without silver rings are for mounting plastic standoffs in to protect the board from flexing once it's in the case. Alright, let's go ahead and put this in the case, and we'll see how it looks when we're all done. One more thing to cover is what does a standoff and what does a screw that plugs in the standoff look like. So this is a standoff right here. Basically what it does is it has threads on this one side here, and those threads are what plug into the actual motherboard or the case itself. So it threads into those holes right here, and then the other side of it looks like that, and it receives a screw that looks like this. It's a very short screw. It has fine machine-like threads. Screw looks like it's wearing a top hat, and the threads aren't very long. They're, you know, I don't know, maybe 1/8 of an inch long, and they will screw into this guy here for all 6 places on this board where it's going to mount. So I'm going to grab 6 of these, put them in each one of those holes in the board that have the circles around them, and then line the board up so that the holes are lined up with this thing here, each one of these here, and then use 6 of these, which will go into those holes in the motherboard that have the silver ring around them, and that's what's going to anchor the board to the case itself. So just so you know, this is what standoffs look like right here. They have the, I'm not sure what size these are, but you can actually use a small little socket to put them in the board. If you know, I usually just finger tighten them, but you can use a socket to put them in the board if you want. And like I said, then just use these to anchor the board. So first this, then the board, then this screws into this through the hole with the silver ring in the board. There's all 6 screw holes with the standoffs inserted and tightened up, ready to receive the board. Let's go ahead and put the board in, and we'll get it screwed down so we can start installing drives and power supplies. Here we go. All set. Now that the board's mounted, I went ahead and installed the power supply. The first time we're using a power supply that has thumb screws. Kind of bizarre. Usually there's regular case screws, but okay. So that leaves us left the drives to mount. That would be the DVD ROM and that SATA adapted ROM, and then we have to figure out what we're going to do for a floppy. I'm not sure if we're just going to use a USB emulated floppy, which is white and it's going to clash the black case, or I'm going to use a black floppy and just go old school with floppy disks. But for the time being, let's go ahead and get those 2 drives mounted in there, and we'll see what they look like when we're all done. So this may take a few minutes, this over a bit so you can get a better angle of the case. And these are extra power cables from the power supply that are going to go to feed the power to those devices. They're kind of long, so I'm hoping I can get them all cable managed in there somehow, and we'll have to go from there. Unfortunately, this board is one of the older boards. They don't really have headers for case fans, which kind of stinks because you don't really get the same case fan cooling you got even with the the newer Pentium 3s and AMD Athlons. But I guess we're just gonna have to make do with the fan on top and hope that's enough. So let's go ahead and get that first device here. Let's see. That's gonna be this guy here. Oops. Okay, this is the SATA device. So we're going to go ahead and install that adapter that we talked about in the previous video. Put that there, and then let's go ahead and get some more cables and screws. Okay, I've got both the drive bays mounted, the DVD-ROM at the top and the SATA drive reader, hot swappable SATA drive bay there. So let's turn this sideways, give you a better look at the mess it looks like in the back. Unfortunately, these all came with their own power, so what I had to do is, in order to minimize cables, which of course is somewhat of a joke considering the fact that I bought a modular power supply to do so, and I still have too many cables and whatnot everywhere. Basically, plug the lower drive into the upper drive to feed it power, and we're going to feed them both off one 4-pin Molex. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to gather all this together, short of this right here, because that'll be for the floppy drive. And we'll get it tucked into this bay here, and with any luck that will give us enough space in the case to still have decent airflow. So then we'll connect the other end of this IDE cable to the motherboard, and already connected the power, and that should be about it. We're almost ready for testing, so we'll be back in a second. It's finally done. Cable routing didn't work exactly like I was hoping it would. It got to be a tight fit because I decided to put both the hard drive and the CD-ROM on the same channel. So I had to reroute my cables in order to make enough room for me to connect to the primary IDE on the motherboard. And unfortunately, because this is an older board, it doesn't have any fan headers for internal fans, but it shouldn't generate that much heat because it's only a Pentium 200 and it has its own cooling fan there. Aside from that, we've got all the board headers hooked up here, and as you can see, short of the cabling mess right here where we get the power supply and our cables for both our CD-ROM and our SATA drive, and then our floppy drive here to load up DOS. Everything else is for the most part pretty neat and clean. Wasn't expecting a miracle because, like I said, this is a relatively small case. But let's go ahead and get a monitor hooked up and turn it on and see if it'll post. First up, we have Doom. It worked out of the box, sounds great, plays great, and it's very smooth. Although I didn't measure the FPS, I'm sure it's somewhere at least in the 50s. TIE Fighter. I haven't really figured out what to do in this game, so I'm just flying around shooting things. I did, however, finally find the instructions though, and realized that it's a significantly more complicated shooter than, say, something like Descent. Perhaps I'll table learning this one for the time being. Duke Nukem 2. I thought it would be fun to bring back something from the early 90s. Although just a 2D side-scroller, there was a certain charm and simplicity to games like this. Lost Vikings. Who doesn't love the story of a Norseman who has no idea of what a spaceship or computer is? So, as you can see, it came together pretty nicely. The hot swappable hard drive cage fit perfect below the optical drive, and the lights all worked without issue. Because this is an SSD and therefore silent, however a PC from yesteryear, I decided it might be nice to maintain that retro sound. So I installed an HDD clicker from Sorta Shop. It imitates the old mechanical hard drive noises based on the flashing of the activity light. Everything I initially tried worked out of the box, which surprised me as I was sure the BIOS was going to have issues with the SSD, so that made me a believer in the StarTech adapter. The 3DFX card gives great performance in DOS, as every game I threw at it worked beautifully, and the integrated ESS chip sounded really nice. All in all, I'd say this was a great build. With the correct adapter, you can get even an SSD working on a socket 7, and aside from the fact that the older boards don't have any headers for fans outside of the CPU, I didn't see any other problems. The case was a little small and cramped, so the inside isn't the same work of art as the new cases with all their cable management magic are, but we're still working with ribbon cables and MOX connectors. What do you want? Once I put the cover back on, no one will know anyway, and fortunately nothing in this case really produces any noticeable heat, so airflow isn't as big of a concern as it is in the 21st century. The only real speed bump I ran into was that the DVD-ROM doesn't have a connector for CD audio, which can be a problem for games before the year 2000. So I decided I'd just use a standard CD-ROM. Let me know if you like this video and this series by subscribing and giving me a thumbs up. Thanks for watching, and I will be back soon with another one.